everyone, this is Minal. Today I'm going to talk to you about identity. Growing up, I've always had conflicting feelings about my island home of Sri Lanka and its national project. The question of Sri Lankan identity is a complex one. What does it mean to call yourself Sri Lankan today? I will help illustrate this by studying the Sri Lankan national flag, its relation to contemporary heritage, and its connection to post colonial history.
From a raised dais, the Duchess watches the Duke, accompanied by the Prime Minister and the Governor-General, raise the flag of the new Dominion. After 146 years of British rule, Ceylon joins the British Commonwealth of Nations as an independent member.
In 1948, Ceylon gained independence from the British Dominion and shortly after became the island of Sri Lanka. The newly formed Sri Lankan state created a national flag to represent its independence. Its design borrowed symbols and ideas from previous flags of the island's ancient kingdoms. This was a concerted effort by the new government to solidify their self-determination in its rejection of previous colonial rule. But in Sri Lanka's effort to reclaim its own identity, did they end up perpetuating its colonial masters' tools? Let's look at the national flag of Sri Lanka. The flag consists of a golden lion brandishing a sword which takes up 1/3 of the flag. The lion represents the might of the majority Sinhalese people, believed to be descendants of Singabahu, an ancient Indian king who killed his father, a lion, to ascend the throne. The lion is encircled by 4 bow leaves at each corner to symbolize the 4 principles of Buddhism, emphasizing the importance of the Buddhist religion in the newly formed government. The lion and the bow leaves are surrounded by a maroon background, which represents the majority Sinhalese people. The orange band symbolizes the Tamil ethnic group, whilst the green band represents the Muslim community of Sri Lanka. The flag is finished off by a golden yellow band to represent the minority communities, namely the indigenous Vaddas, Malays, Burghers, Afro-Lankans, and the Chinese Sri Lankan community. The flag has attempted to include all communities in Sri Lanka. However, is this act of representation an act of colonial categorization? Personally, it is hard for me to connect with this flag as someone who was born into a mixed ethnic family. My father is Sinhalese Buddhist. A large portion of this flag is relevant to this ethnic group. However, my mother is mixed, just like me. She's half Tamil and half Dutch Burgher, the ethnic group that was a result of colonial settlers intermixing with local communities. If I were to correctly try to plot myself on this flag, I do not belong to any absolute community. Perhaps the flag is a representation of how categorization will invariably lead to people feeling alienated. Where did this categorization originate, and was it always a part of my island's history? Let's hear a short excerpt of an interview with award-winning author Vajira Chandrasekhara with Himal South Asia about his thoughts on post-colonial Sri Lanka, a recurring theme in most of his work.
You know about Operation Legacy, right? It was in the era of decolonization, of recolonization under different protocols, you might say. The British Colonial Office had a formal policy between the 50s through to the 70s of destroying vast amounts of records around the world, the records that would have exposed various colonial crimes to the newly independent colonies. It was called Operation Legacy. So they set fire, quite literally, most of the time, I think, to the historical record. In order to erase the actionable evidence and effectively to destroy memory in a very literal way. Right? So in much the same way that the colonial era had already destroyed so much of what it had conquered in the process of what was unironically considered its civilizing mission. And then in our lifetimes, in the so-called post-colonial era, this is what the former colonies also inherited, right? The same toolkit of history, burning, violence, like Many post-colonial states, such as Sri Lanka, begin that post-independence history in these tremendous exercises of what can only be called colonial violence, like the Ceylon Citizenship Act in the late 40s and the Sinhala-only Act in the mid-50s. So these were the inherited colonial tools by which an ethno-religious supremacist elite political culture ensures its demographic and political domination in the decades to come. And that's also rooted in the same kind of erasure of people, of language, of history, with the same toolkit of rewriting history to the convenience of a ruling class.
Inequalities and interethnic tensions always existed throughout our ancient kingdoms, however, were arguably less pronounced than they are today. It is well documented that the colonial settlers used divide and conquer strategies to ensure control over their colonies, like the schooling system they introduced, which persists today. Schools were divided by language to ensure that ethnic groups were separated. Their history lessons were also dependent on what language they were taught in. The results are the forming of communities that were fractured from deep divides and misunderstandings, which still plague the country to this very day. To some, perhaps the minority Tamil and Muslim ethnic communities, this flag represents the state's repression. Whilst the flag attempted at reunifying the country, it only further excluded the communities that weren't accurately represented in the flag. This is further exacerbated by the civil war that lasted almost 30 years and ended in 2009 between the Tamil separatist movement, the LTTE, and the Sri Lankan army. But do all the Sri Lankans view the flag in such a critical manner? For some Sri Lankans, the flag evokes a sense of pride and belonging. It symbolizes unity amongst many communities that live in Sri Lanka. It has also become a powerful tool of national identity and resistance to the colonial Western rule. For instance, during the 2022 uprising called the Aragalaya movement or the struggle movement, thousands of people took to the street in protest of the ruling president, armed with the Sri Lankan flags in their hands. The streets were transformed by a sea of people waving the flag in a moment of solidarity. People, irrespective of ethnic differences, came together at a point of absolute economic meltdown. The flag is co-opted to represent calls for justice and accountability by activists and citizens alike. For others, these images were just another example of how the Sinhalese majority was blind to their pleas for equal representation in the socio-political sphere. The flag reconfirmed the majority's lack of understanding of minority exclusion. As explained by Appaya, identity is social, and Sri Lanka's Great Divide affects the identity of its citizens. But are there other countries that faced similar problems with their national flag and its connection to national identity and unity? Some parallels can be drawn to countries like South Africa. Following apartheid, the flag was used as a unifying symbol to represent the country's new beginnings. However, some criticize the flag for being unsuccessful in its including of all ethnic groups of the country and the socio and economic realities faced by certain communities. The same can be said of the Indian flag, that some feel does not include the Muslim community and the pluralistic, secular society it's supposed to embody. We see how the Palestinian and Israeli flags are used to symbolize different historical narratives. Each flag can evoke strong emotions of nationhood, but also conflict and divide. Canada's maple leaf has also been criticized by Indigenous communities for not adequately including their presence, history, and contributions to the country. Many countries with a history of colonization have faced similar issues with their national flags as a form of representation. The flag not only becomes a symbol of solidarity and nationhood, but also a point of contestation and divide. Identity in a post-colonial context is hard to define. It's often relies on representation, which can be argued stems from ethnographic methods and classification. These often shallow ways of categorization leave no space for hybridity and complex identities. Identity is seen as fixed, whereas in reality, it can be often malleable. Putting the Sri Lankan flag into context during Sri Lankan independence, the flag was seen as a symbol of self-determination and freedom from colonial rule. However, in contemporary Sri Lanka, the flag is seen as a symbol of nationalist, mostly singular Buddhist rule. Many artists have reckoned with the flag, like Imad Majid, who built a doorway with only the orange and green stripes to represent an alternate reality that primarily includes the minority communities. Hema Shuroni uses the flag in different iterations, playing with color, disintegration, erasure, and ethnic divide. Artists have begun to try and visualize an alternative flag, one that highlights the disproportionate representation of majority communities and their place in society as the purest Sri Lankans. Sri Lankan still grapples with this national identity following its independence. The flag reflects deeper questions of belonging and identity in a post-colonial society. It has become a potent symbol that represents pride and belonging for some, whilst representing division and control for others. I wonder, would these feelings still exist if the flag bore symbols of the island's bountiful nature? Could this be a decolonial act? I used to teach art at a design university in my hometown of Colombo. I tasked my students to envision a Sri Lankan flag that everyone could relate to, irrespective of age, ethnicity, and religion. The results were wonderful. My classroom was full of flags that used the ocean, the coconut tree, and the peacock as symbols to represent a unified island. Perhaps focusing on our similarities would help us move towards a more inclusive society and culture?